Hello, and welcome to This Week in Sociological Perspective. I'm your host, Samuel Roundfield Lucas. This week, we discuss some insights from World War II and the nuclear standoff and its aftermath. But first, I recently spoke with Professor Daniel Karell of Yale University about his recent paper titled Small Town Propaganda: The Content and Emotions of Politicized Digital and Local News in the United States. The paper is to be published in Poetics and is co-authored by Anjali Agrawal. Professor Karell, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
So your study asked whether different kinds of news websites use different kinds of approaches, and if so, what are the differences? And you study news sites from small towns, or at least not big cities. Why focus on small towns?
Yeah, so that's actually first a great way of putting it, that I just study different type, or this study is about different types of websites, because you could have said it's about kind of misinformation or disinformation websites, but I think that's kind of not the approach that my co-author and I wanted to take, which is like assuming misinformation or disinformation. So yeah, the reason we picked small towns was mostly because that is what the kind of the observation that we saw kind of drove us to these sites or these small towns. So what I mean by that is that we had heard in the popular media, like in news reports, about these, let's say, doppelganger sites that kind of were politically right-wing, that were being created for small town or like local communities across the United States. And so that kind of motivated the interest in those sites.
What makes it what is this doppelganger site?
Yeah, so that's actually kind of what we set out to study. So in 2019, there were several news reports of these websites that looked visually just like local newspaper websites. And that in itself is kind of interesting because they weren't quote unquote real. And they also, the kind of the reporters who investigate these websites kind of labeled them, or kind of just, categorized them as right-wing disinformation websites that were not real newspapers. And so that kind of sparked our interest, and we wanted to study them, but without this kind of presumption that they were right-wing or disinformation or whatnot. We kind of wanted to let the data speak for themselves, or let the content speak for itself, because if it's a website that's reporting local news, like what is real or unreal about it?
So that's actually the next question I was going to ask. When I hear people talk about these things, they use terms like fake news or propaganda, but often, I'm skeptical because these labels get assigned to a story or a news source often to just discredit it or dismiss it. And so it just sounds like, another term in a struggle between different sides. So I'm wondering, though, is there a technical definition to these terms that makes them descriptive labels rather than simply dismissive labels? Or are there other more different technical terms we could use to identify news sites that would be of concern for some reason?
Yeah, so this ended up being kind of a big part of the revision process, actually, when we were trying to get this paper published. Because a lot of the feedback that we got from the reviewers was actually about these terms and how they're conceptualized. And so what I would say that I think is good is that the reviewers directed us to some very recent or new research that kind of made the point that these terms like fake news and disinformation and misinformation now mean different things to different people, or essentially they're subjective, right? And they're normative, and people use them to make normative claims and to attack each other. And so they really kind of have lost some analytic utility. So that was great. I mean, I'm not I don't work in kind of the theoretical development of these terms. And so that was heartening, I think, to see. But we had to kind of describe what we were studying in some way, right? To kind of help the reader understand what this project was about. And so we picked the term propaganda, which itself is, a loaded term with history and debate over what is and what is not propaganda, and but we found a useful definition, which is kind of non-consensual information, or kind of a non-consensual story. And what this means is that the information doesn't give the reader the tools to adjudicate that for themselves, the accuracy or the honesty behind it. Maybe another way, kind of how I was thinking about it informally as I was writing, was kind of, is it honest? Like, rather, is it true or not true? Like, is it being honest with the reader? And so, we kind of clearly, there's a couple of paragraphs where we discuss, how these terms, fake news and disinformation and whatnot, have changed, and now they're kind of used and kind of lobbed in all these different ways. And so we just are very clearly kind of saying, we're calling this propaganda, but what we mean by this is that this content, or the people who wrote this content, aren't giving, aren't kind of, as a kind of, this definition puts it, like, aren't being consensual. They're not giving consensual information in the sense of giving the reader all the context or the information that they need to make informed choices.
So
it's still a fuzzy, sorry to interrupt, it's still a fuzzy definition, of course, but I mean, this is it's a tricky, it's not a, clear cut, I think.
Yeah, that's I mean, I can see that, because I'm led to, this is way beyond, but it sort of puts it in bold relief. One person's propaganda might be another person's important story. And so it makes me remember, I hope I'm not, spoiler alert, okay. I'm remembering Men in Black, the movie, where one character is saying, we're going to check out the news, and they go to this news kiosk, and they pick up the National Enquirer and several other kinds of things that are dismissed. And then the other person there, who's just now learning about the existence of these non-human species from other planets that have come to the Earth, says, what is this? He says, well, this is the only newspaper that tells the truth. And it's about two-head and whatever. I know you're not, obviously, you're in a different zone, but it just, in that story, it was funny because it also, it referenced something that's accurate, that some people would regard something as very important, and another person will maybe regard it as propaganda because it's overstating the case for one side or another. So if that's the world that we're living in, that it's being used more, not in the technical, analytic kind of academic way you're using, but in sort of this just weaponized way, we're going to label that propaganda. Why identify propaganda? Why identify these news sites? Why is that important in your analysis? Or why do you think, why does that lead you to want to identify these kinds of sites and investigate whether they really are different, and in what ways?
Yeah, well, again, we were kind of motivated for this particular project. We were motivated by these news reports, again, in national news outlets like the New York Times and Columbia Journalism Review and other places like this. We were motivated by kind of investigating what the difference is, if any, and just kind of, approaching it kind of in this agnostic way. Again, like, different from kind of starting off with the labels or the categories that they are disinformation or propaganda or whatnot. And kind of a big step, I guess, to answer your question as of like, why do this? I suppose it's kind of because they were getting attention, or these types of sites were getting attention, and, approach again in this way of kind of starting off or presuming a difference. And also, actually, what, when I was reading these newspaper articles, of course, there's no comparison case, right? And you should, obviously, social scientists should always ask, like, what is the comparison? And so a big part of the data collection was actually collecting the quote unquote real newspapers from these towns and constructing this data set that overlapped in time and space. And then we could allow ourselves kind of get some empirical leverage on the question of, are these different? And if a bunch of people are calling this set of newspapers fake or disinformation or propaganda, let's just see like what that means empirically, and so I guess we approach it kind of from that way. And so why do it? Well, I think it was just kind of an empirical exercise. And also I should say kind of a first step, we're pretty clear in the paper that we see this as kind of a first stab at these data and understanding this. But as a first step, seeing, whether we can kind of empirically distinguish them and kind of find any interesting differences between these two sets that kind of would then justify maybe labeling them and labeling some in one way and some in another way.
So when you start out, you have these different kinds of sites. Some of those neighborhood sites. What are the other kinds of sites? I mean, I know you didn't say neighborhood, small town. That's
yeah. Well, these would be from the quote unquote real local outlets, or kind of established, or what we end up calling institutional outlets. So it would be, let's say like Lansing, Michigan has a newspaper that's been around for decades and they have a website. And so that would be the quote unquote institutional one, or what people might call real or whatever, established. And then, so we kind of match those with the so-called fake ones. Yeah.
So what similarities or differences did you find between these different kinds of news sites?
Yeah, so I would say the main takeaway, although there are minor differences, the main takeaway is that they're actually really similar if one approaches them from kind of a big data computational technique or methodology, which is what we did because we had a lot. And so, if you kind of look at, if you do a content analysis with, let's say, like topic models, or you do a sentiment analysis, there's really not that big differences. Now the caveat should be that when we collected the data, we wanted to we were thinking about how to make this kind of in terms of the design of the comparison. A lot of the let's just say real local newspapers had a bunch of sections that the fake ones didn't. So for instance, like a style section, or like a cooking or home section. So when thinking about the design, if we included these sections of the newspaper in the quote, again, I'm just going to use the terms real and fake, but we already discussed about how these are problematic terms. Let's say that if we include those in the real ones, we would find these like really stark differences, right? Because just the fake ones don't have that. So we did make the decision to only compare the content or the text from sections that both newspapers have in common. So, kind of conditional upon that, we found very little difference overall between the two. So what does this mean? Well, one interpretation could mean that the doppelganger sites or the right-leaning fake sites are actually pretty good at mimicking the established sites. But we did find some minor differences, or more subtle differences between the two as well.
But another interpretation would be that the doppelganger sites are copying if they are copying the institutional sites, that the institutional sites have those same features, that it's not that, I mean, that they're, but I guess I want to back up
for sure. Yeah.
I want to back up a little bit and try to figure out. So tell me, you and your team sat down and read thousands of news stories from all these different sites and then classified them or coded them in some way. Is that what's happening?
No, sorry. We used, we used kind of computational techniques. So we did end up reading a subset when we started investigating the differences. But the way we started the analysis was kind of an automated approach to thinking about both two dimensions of content. One is just text, or sorry, topics. And so the way kind of words hang together across documents. And so people interpret these as topics or themes. So this was a topic model. And then the second dimension was emotions, the kind of the use of emotionally salient words and their frequencies. We did, and so kind of as a first stab, we did these two analyses and found minor differences, or that not major differences, and kind of some minor differences. And then we investigated these minor differences a little further by reading a bunch of documents.
Okay, so
we did not read all of them, though.
Yes. Going back to so this method then means it's not like, so here's the question.
Okay.
So I read a story in institutional news site A, and you know, I read it, and it's you know, I have whatever emotional, very little emotional reaction. It seems okay. Then I read the same exact story, like somebody, I'm imagining an experiment where somebody randomly assigns people to two. So maybe it's better to think about it as this instead of what I was going to say, because obviously I would recognize it was the same story. But if you randomly assign the same two, you created two random groups, so they're expected to be equal. Then you give one a news story, but you put it on the letterhead or under the masthead of the institutional site, and you give the same story to another set of a randomly equal group, but you give the masthead of this doppelganger site, this sort of questionable site. And then do they react the same? And so the risk there is that people they're responding more to the surroundings of the story than the story. But what I'm gathering from your analysis is that you're not in danger of being your understanding being contaminated by knowing where the source of the story was. You're just looking at the story shorn of any surroundings, and then it gets coded in an automatic way by basically the computer counting up words, and then you can analyze. Now you add in the source and say, these are, they look very similar. There's not big differences depending upon the site. Is that an accurate restate? No, you know, am I understanding correctly what you did?
Yeah, more or less. That's actually a charitable answer. I thought this was going to be a critique of the method because we ignore these kind of contextual clues from the layout or the masthead or whatnot. But yeah, I mean, the advantage of the approach is that we are only dealing with the text, with the words, and the occurrence of the words in terms of how frequently they occur and how frequently they occur in the context of other words. So yeah, we're able to kind of divorce the analysis from these other contextual clues, which are really important. And I could talk about from kind of an anecdotal impression, like from me just reading a bunch of them, and talk about like analyses that I would love to do as a next step or somebody else could do, because the visual clues that you were talking about, I think do end up mattering.
Yeah, well,
or matter.
You also said there were some smaller, more subtle differences. So maybe that, and you can bring in, you know, whatever those are, and then I can move to these other visual cues. But I just, you know, the reason I was asking that question is that if I felt like somebody sat down and read a bunch of newspapers, I would feel, well, because we know that the surroundings can affect things. So, and it could easily be misleading and make you feel more critical towards something because of surrounding, even though the person feels like they gave you the full story. So it's good to see that that's what if I'm understanding correctly, that's what you did. And so now I have more confidence in what you found as really reflecting similarities with some subtle differences.
Yeah, right. So, right, we the algorithm kind of clusters the words and estimates their prevalence, and then we can use kind of the type of or which kind of set the article or the text came from as, let's say, a covariate or predictor variable, which will then, we can estimate like any differences in prevalence conditional upon this covariate.
So what you said, there were some more subtle or nuanced differences between these.
Yep. Yeah. So there are a couple. So one, if you're just kind of let's say doing a topic model on content and kind of measuring or estimating the prevalence of different topics, what does jump out as a difference is the use of kind of readily and easily available text online that is kind of just reproduced verbatim in the quote unquote fake sites. So for example, a lot of the articles were just press releases or official reports that were online, kind of a large volume were gasoline prices that were being reported on local websites. And so it looked like a big part of what is going on behind the scenes in these fake sites or propagandistic sites is scraping local content and just kind of padding the website with this content that is readily available online. It's not reporting, it's not interpretivist in any way at all. It's just a press release that's duplicated. Which interestingly, going back to an earlier point that we talked about like, what does it mean to be fake news or truthful news? What's interesting about this is that it's like this information is actually true, right? I mean, it's like that is the true gasoline price of the local gasoline stations, or that is a true press release from a local organization. So yeah, so that was kind of one big difference. And then a subtle difference, and this came from a reading, kind of just an exploratory reading, because after we didn't find any stark differences other than this kind of copying text from the internet, we read a bunch of articles, and what I found, or what we found, was kind of a very subtle use of language. Kind of, this is where it became clear, like maybe where the propaganda is coming out, or kind of this subtle like effort of manipulation, is really have to do with like business regulation and kind of conservative. Well, in the United States, we would think of kind of a conservative take on, like politically conservative take on business regulations, kind of this very pro-business, very business friendly kind of rhetoric, but kind of subtly embedded in articles. And the kind of blunt tools of the computational techniques didn't pick this out because, again, like it wasn't overt. And so, we talk a little bit about in the discussion of the paper how, the methods that we use in this initial analysis in this initial kind of effort were not subtle enough to we're not sensitive enough to pick out this difference. But I think that like if these papers are having any effect, that's kind of maybe where it's coming from. Although I can talk about the visual aspect of it because there is something I want to say about that that we didn't study. But yeah, so it seems like that's kind of where the rhetoric, or maybe the ideological rhetoric, is kind of coming through.
And what about this visual elements that you picked up?
Yeah, so this is something I'd love to do, and kind of maybe next or somebody else could do it, but this I didn't expect, maybe because I don't spend a lot of time. I'll tip my hand. I personally don't spend my personal time reading these sites, so I didn't know to expect this. But the digital ads were very striking and very different, and it wasn't quite, it's kind of beyond, at the time, was kind of not clear to me how to isolate the ads and analyze them. And, we'll have to use some computer vision tools because a lot of it's in the imagery. But the ads were kind of very, I would say that's kind of like where maybe the overt messaging came out, of kind of ads for anti-immigrant organizations or pro-Trump ads, things like this. And my sense is that for the, I don't know the journalists who originally kind of exposed this trend or this kind of population of sites, but I would guess that's probably what led them to guess these were right-wing sites, is from the advertisements. But let's just say they're very different from what comes up on the New York Times webpage. So.
Would there be equivalent left-wing sites, left-wing doppelganger sites?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. Perhaps, I don't know. I mean, some people might say, again, going back to the original conversation about what makes kind of politicized disinformation, some people might say, oh, well, go look at the NPR or something. I wouldn't say that, but right, some people might.
But there's MSNBC, and then we're talking about small towns, which just means that, if I'm not aware of it already, of the town, I'm not necessarily going to learn of this site. And also these, while one side of the political spectrum may innovate, eventually the other side of the political spectrum tends to copy it. So it's if it proves effective or is thought to be effective. So
yeah. Well, this is an interesting question. This is kind of outside my field of expertise, kind of my immediate field of expertise, but I have ended up being kind of, through my research, being exposed to this kind of related subfield or subfield of research, which is thinks a lot about the symmetry, the political symmetry in these tactics. And my sense is actually that it's not very symmetrical, that it really is kind of a right-wing thing, and not just in the United States, but also in Western Europe and places like India, that it's for whatever reason, and we can hypothesize, or I might have some ideas, I'm sure lots of people do, for whatever reason, it seems to be really driven by the right, kind of picking up these, using these kind of propagandistic digital and social media techniques. But this is just for me reading some academic journals or academic articles.
Yeah, it sounds like some more research with your technique of your approach of sort of looking at a population of organizations, or at least a sample from a population to sort of figure out. But with the findings you have, what does it mean? Does it have any meaning for the information to which people in the locations where these news sites are? Does it have any implications for their information access?
Yeah, well, I guess kind of what would the implications be? One thing that I think would be a key lesson, or kind of maybe a key question that people kind of in towns that have these sites would be, why is somebody paying? So I mean, that's kind of an interesting thing, right? Like, somebody's paying for this stuff, right? And it's not very clear who, like, for instance, I Google Street View the offices of, whatever addresses I could find, link to these sites. And it's kind of this nondescript office park in Wyoming, right? With the windows, with blinds over the windows and no sign. So somebody's paying for this. And so for the people in these the residents of these localities, good questions like, why is somebody paying to create these sites for my town and subtly embed pro-business rhetoric, right? And like, why us? And it could be just to turn out the vote, or kind of like manipulate kind of elections down the road. It could be to kind of change people's minds. I'm not saying it's like a hidden or hard to infer reason, but we don't know, right? It's kind of completely speculative. We can guess and probably make good guesses, but so I would say that's kind of one takeaway from this. And also the fact that there are some differences. And so if their friends on Facebook or Twitter or whatnot are directing them toward these sites, kind of maybe awareness of, it's not it in a lot of ways might be like the newspaper you're used to, but there are subtle differences or minor differences.
Well, it sounds like an area of, I mean, this is an important step in this direction, but there are also a lot of intriguing and important questions. So I want to thank you, Professor Karell, for the work you've done and for sharing it with us today.
Great. Yeah, well, thank you. You're welcome. And thanks for having me. And thanks again for the invitation and chatting with me today.
Our final segment concerns some perhaps forgotten insights from World War II and the Cold War nuclear standoff. Several headlines herald increasing concern with the fate of the people and the nation of Ukraine as the Russian assault escalates. According to a New York Post report from March 4th, in a video speech to the people of Ukraine, President Volodymyr Zelensky expressed frustration with NATO's refusal to institute a no-fly zone he has requested. He stated, quote, "We believe that NATO countries themselves have created a narrative that the closure of the sky over Ukraine would provoke Russia's direct aggression against NATO. This is self-hypnosis of those who are weak, underconfident, although they may have weapons many times more powerful than ours." President Zelensky added, knowing that new strikes and casualties are inevitable, NATO deliberately decided not to close the sky over Ukraine. On March 5th, the New York Times reported that Senator Ben Sasse, Republican of Nebraska, said, quote, "Zelensky's message is simple. Close the skies or give us planes. Let's be clear-eyed about our options. A no-fly zone means sending American pilots into combat against Russian jets and air defenses in a battle between nuclear powers that could spiral out of control quickly." That same day, the National Review reported that Russian President Vladimir Putin said, "We hear calls to impose a no-fly zone over Ukraine. Any moves in such direction will be seen by us as participation in an armed conflict by the country that will create threats to our servicemen." He further stated that the imposition of a no-fly zone, quote, would bring catastrophic results not only to Europe, but to the whole world. On March 6th, a teaser for a Today Show interview read, quote, "Pressure will build in West to implement no-fly zone," analyst says. On March 7th, in an article headlined, "Russia accused of using cluster munitions and vacuum bombs in Ukraine," Yahoo News reported that the United States has credible evidence of Russia deliberately targeting civilians in their invasion of Ukraine. Secretary of State Antony Blinken indicated that such attacks would constitute a war crime. On March 8th, a Newsweek headline announced another development, quote, "Open letter urging Biden put no-fly zone over Ukraine, signed by 27 foreign policy experts." These headlines and the reports underneath them are likely distressing. It would be hard to be human and not be upset, distressed, angry, or in some other way concerned about what is being perpetrated in Ukraine. At the same time, there are concepts and insights we can bring to bear to make sense of what is happening, what options there may be, and what is at stake with every decision anyone involved may make. One insight from World War II is that bombing civilians does not break the spirit of the countries targeted. 80 years ago, the argument goes, the technology was insufficient for precision nighttime bombing of military resources nestled in and around urban areas. And nighttime bombing was necessary because anti-aircraft measures were more effective in daylight. So Hitler first, and the Allies next, bombed cities packed with civilians. Post-war sociological and other research revealed that, as a military tactic, bombing civilians was a failure. Hitler's bombing of London did not break Britain's resolve. The Allies' bombing of Dresden did not break Germany's resolve. More recent research, like that of Michael Hurlwitz and Dan Ryder, confirmed this finding for a longer time frame, going back to 1917 to the more recent period. And so does relatively recent experience confirm it. So I ask you, was American resolve broken by the 9/11 terror bombings, or was it strengthened? Seen in this way, one has to wonder about the mental state of the Russian leadership. Bombing civilians is not a rational military tactic to win a war, though it is a rational tactic if the aim is to simply harm or kill people. That the Russians are bombing civilians means it is reasonable to wonder whether the leadership are able to act as rational actors. It is reasonable to wonder whether one can predict their responses to changing tactical and strategic conditions. It is reasonable to wonder whether they can tolerate failing to gain everything they seek. A second insight concerns the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, MAD. You don't hear much about MAD these days, but it was a cornerstone of the deterrence theories governments used to decide which weapons systems and geopolitical moves were stabilizing and which were destabilizing. The doctrine of MAD is pretty simple. Each nation must know that if they launch a first strike, the target of the first strike will be able to launch a devastating counterstrike. In other words, both foes need to know that they gain nothing from striking first, because their opponent will still be able to destroy them, even if from the grave of their own collapsed buildings. This doctrine partly accounts for the extremely large number of nuclear weapons in the United States and the Soviet Union at the time possessed, and it explains the diversity of launching platforms for those weapons. Unfortunately, mutually assured destruction works as a deterrent strategy only if all leaders involved want to live or want their nation to live. If a leader comes to feel that an impending loss is intolerable, they may decide to launch a massive first strike in hopes of turning the impending loss into victory. They may reason that by launching first, they have a chance to survive if their opponent decides not to launch a counterstrike or is unable to do so. And they may find the downside of being destroyed in a counterstrike acceptable if they also destroy their opponent. And that outcome may be preferred to losing a conventional war while failing to unleash the full power of their weaponry. MAD implies that it is dangerous to push a nuclear foe into a corner, especially one whose tactics, such as the decision to target civilians in Ukraine, leave everyone else concerned for their mental health already. A third insight concerns the necessity of bright lines and a wide berth. It is well known that in war, as in other things, accidents happen, and it's difficult to carry out precise maneuvers. Ships and planes can lose their navigation and drift into peril. Bombs can fall out of bomb bays by mistake. Targeting software can fail. Messages with instructions can be garbled. Corrected versions can be jammed, and so on. Given the certainty that mistakes will happen, for approximately 50 years, the United States and Soviet Union avoided placing their troops on the same battlefield. Often proxies were pushed forward instead, a strategy with its own problems and inherent disrespect. But by keeping their armed forces at greater than arm's length, the two countries reduced the chance for error to push them into a nuclear war. Notably, mistakes still happened. One legendary incident occurred 3 weeks after the Soviets had shot down a commercial airliner that had strayed into restricted Soviet airspace, an event that heightened tensions. Amidst that tension, on the evening of September 26, 1983, the Soviet early warning radar detected a launch of 6 missiles from the United States. The officer on duty, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov, believed it was a malfunction in the radar and reported the supposed launch detection as a malfunction. This act disobeyed a standing order to quickly begin the process of launching a retaliatory strike upon signal that a missile launch had occurred. Had he followed protocol, and the Soviets had ended up launching, a U.S. counterstrike would have followed, and who knows where it would have ended. The world learned of this incident 15 years after it happened. The fourth and final insight I want to note provides the larger context, or at least a larger context, for this war. It is an insight summarized in one term developed in that era: nuclear winter. A nuclear war can produce a nuclear winter. Each nuclear explosion causes massive fires and throws radioactive debris into the air. If enough smoke from enough fires rises high enough to enter the upper atmosphere, it can block out the sun for years, leading to the collapse of agriculture and starvation. The first work on the possibility of nuclear winter considered the case of a massive nuclear exchange between the United States and the Soviet Union, one that would rain nuclear bombs down onto almost every continent. The findings of that research, findings confirmed by National Academy of Science Review, were that a nuclear winter could be started by such an exchange. It could basically end all human life on the planet. But those nations have massive arsenals, and if 8,000 nuclear bombs are launched, surely the effects cannot be good. That is one response. And following on that, one might say that Ukraine is one country and presents a small battle space. Consequently, some might say, a massive nuclear exchange is unlikely. Let's set aside the insights noted earlier of how difficult it may be to precisely predict an adversary's response. And let's set aside the evidence that the Russian leadership is distracted from pure military calculation, such that a military assessment may not be involved in whether a stopping point for a nuclear exchange can be found once an exchange is underway. Consider instead the breakthrough research of Alan Robach and Owen Brian Toon, summarized in a 2010 article in Scientific American, that established that a regional nuclear exchange totaling as few as 100 nuclear bombs could blot out the sun long enough to collapse agriculture and starve a minimum of 1 billion people. 100 nuclear bombs is less than 1.5% of the nuclear arsenal of the United States and Russia. Seen in this way, the implication of this research for us today is any use of nuclear weapons risks an exchange that will bring famine and pestilence to billions at best. These insights mean that no one is negligently consigning the people of Ukraine to a deadly shower of cluster bombs and vacuum bombs. It is just that the entire human species is at risk. And with that as a risk, one must tread very carefully. We can all understand President Zelensky's frustration and fury. But sometimes one's hands, powerful though they may be, are tied, and there is very little that one can do, or at least there's a very severe limit on what one can do. It's difficult and arguably sad to recall these insights from the past. When the Soviet Union collapsed and the United States legislatures spoke of a peace dividend and that military budgets could be scaled back, there was hope for a different kind of world. A world where these insights would be relevant only in the history book. But that world did not emerge. And now we are back to the prospect of large, wealthy, well-armed nation states and coalitions waging war that may spill out of the bounds some think will contain the war and end up imperiling everyone. As we navigate this predicament, the past strategies and insights offer no guarantee of success. But these insights should give us pause, just as wisdom and experience gave Lieutenant Colonel Petrov pause. May we pause before the evidence before us, pause before we act precipitously, with precision on our mind and good intentions in our heart, and stumble our way into making this war the war that ends all wars, and everything else as well. That's This Week in Sociological Perspective. We hope to be back next week with another interview with an author of some important sociological research and more sociological insights on an issue in the news. Till then, take care.